When Maserati builds a new convertible, you can expect more than just a convertible.
Back in 1989, Chrysler released the TC by Maserati, a two-seat convertible developed from a partnership between Chrysler CEO Lee Iacocca and Maserati owner Alejandro de Tomaso, aiming to bring the Chrysler brand more upmarket in return for providing financial help for the struggling Maserati brand. The result was another variation of the Chrysler K-Car that looked a lot like Chrysler's own LeBaron, but cost twice as much, leading to so few buyers it was canceled after only 3 model years, and is widely considered one of Chrysler's biggest sales failures. This is a story of the Chrysler TC by Maserati. This is my old car.
When Maserati built this new convertible, they made it everything you expect and made it exclusively for Chrysler.
After the release of an earlier episode I made about the Chrysler LeBaron, I had several people question why I didn't mention the TC in that episode, as they assumed the TC was just a variation of the LeBaron. I now regret that I didn't mention it there, but I didn't think of it at the time, since technically the TC was its own unique platform. But that platform had itself been a modified K-car design, as was the LeBaron. The latter point is definitely a factor in why the TC is so famous, or rather infamous, today. Although Chrysler today is part of Stellantis, which also includes the Maserati brand, back in the early 80s, it was a different story. Chrysler almost went under if not for a government bailout, and the release of its new K-Car platform quickly proved to be a huge success, and by 1984, Chrysler had adapted the K-Car platform to several other cars in their lineup. Despite nearly dissolving just a few years earlier, Chrysler CEO Lee Iacocca had big plans to continue to move the Chrysler brand more upscale. Back when Iacocca was with Ford in the 1970s, he started a friendship with Alejandro de Tomaso. De Tomaso had his own auto company in Italy named after him back then, and their most popular model was the Pantera, launched in 1971. The Pantera had a Ford V8 engine and was sold at Lincoln Mercury dealerships. De Tomaso would later become owner of Maserati, a brand that had produced many legendary cars, such as the Quattroporte that started in 1973.
De Tomaso fu iniziato il progetto di questa qua, disegnata da Giugiaro.
And some not so legendary, such as the Bi-Turbo, starting in 1981. By 1984, times were tough for Maserati, and they needed financial help. Maserati still had a name which evoked luxury and performance, and Iacocca saw an opportunity to help De Tomaso, and at the same time take advantage of the Maserati name for his company's benefit. Although Chrysler already had a convertible offering starting in 1982 with the second generation LeBaron, it was a 4-seater, and its boxy shape wasn't all that different from the original K-cars that it was based on.
This is a 1983 Chrysler LeBaron, or what's left of it.
In order to go more upscale and become a flagship model, the next Chrysler convertible would need to be a 2-seat roadster and be good enough to compete against one of the benchmarks for convertible luxury back then, the Mercedes 450 SL. And yes, ironically, many years later, Chrysler sold a roadster which actually was a thinly disguised Mercedes, but that's a story for a potential future episode. But even Iacocca knew that the Chrysler name itself could not compete with Mercedes, but maybe Maserati could. In 1984, a joint venture between the two companies was made official, with its first car to be a roadster called the TC. At the time, the letters TC was intended to stand for Turbo Convertible, although the car would later be offered with a non-turbo V6. Regardless of what TC actually meant, using a 2-character name was probably also considered more European at the time, and adding the by Maserati onto the name was to make it clear that this would be no ordinary Chrysler. The TC would be built on what Chrysler called the Q platform, although it was similar to their J platform, which would underpin the upcoming third generation of the LeBaron that was scheduled to launch for the 1987 model year, which in turn was similar to the Dodge Daytona's platform. The idea was that the TC would be released before the LeBaron to establish that the TC was Chrysler's flagship, and the LeBaron would arrive later as a more affordable 4-seater option. Many of the Chrysler executives were skeptical about the TC, but could do little to dissuade Iacocca from his dream of developing what he thought would become a classic Italian roadster. But although the relationship between Iacocca and De Tomaso remained strong, their respective companies could not work together nearly as well. What was expected to be a development time of 2 years stretched into 5 years. The third generation LeBaron launched in 1987 without the TC to establish itself as the flagship, and instead, the new LeBaron proved to be a big hit on its own, without help from the TC. But the LeBaron wasn't good enough to be a flagship model, so now the TC had to outshine the LeBaron, which was a bigger challenge now that the order of their releases to the public was reversed, making the TC look instead like an overpriced LeBaron. The TC was also released 2 years after what was likely its closest competitor at the time, the Cadillac Alante, which followed a similar formula of creating an expensive Italian-built, yet somewhat bland-looking roadster. Buick would also offer a convertible version of its Rietta Coupe during the TC's run. Both the Alante and Rietta are being considered for future My Old Car episodes. The initial engine offering for the TC was a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder, essentially the same as the base engine in the Dodge Daytona, making just 160 horsepower, and it was only available with a 3-speed automatic transmission, so a true sports car it wasn't. However, 500 of the TC models received what their owners presumably assumed was a Maserati engine, since the Maserati name was imprinted on top of the valve cover that had been cast by Cosworth in England, and the final engine assembly was done by Maserati in Italy. But underneath, it was mostly the same Chrysler 2.2-liter Turbo 4, but now with 16 valves and a Getrag manual transmission. It made 200 horsepower, a considerable jump from 160, but wasn't exactly as fast as many back then would associate with Maserati. Inside, the TC had plenty of hand-stitched leather, not just on the seats, but even on the dash and door panels. It had its own unique wooden shift knob and a prominent TC logo on the dash, which was a Chrysler Pentastar with the Maserati logo inside. That same logo was also on the front grille, which I guess did look a little bit like the typical Maserati grille. Each TC came with a removable hardtop, complete with opera windows, which sat on top of a hinged tonneau cover. Underneath that cover was a folding soft top, which surprisingly wasn't even powered. You had to manually open the tonneau cover and pull the top up or down yourself. And although it was a two-seater and 9 inches shorter than the LeBaron, it still had a considerable amount of space behind the seats, and a trunk whose interior space wasn't diminished when the top was down. The TC was built across 3 locations within Italy, with body stamping in Torino, and assembly split up between Sparone and Milan. Despite the body panels being unique to the TC, to anyone else they look very similar to the LeBaron.
LeBaron, right?
Sadly, little was done to make the TC look different enough from the LeBaron to justify the entire process being done in Italy. Production of the struts, brakes, and even the wheels were outsourced to other European companies, all of which added additional cost which no one, except maybe the car's owner, would really appreciate. Speaking of cost, the price for each buyer in 1989 was $33,000. In today's dollars, it would be over $72,000. The LeBaron cost $14,000 less back then.
You're coming to a Maserati dealership and got an appraisal for $1, which is about 99 cents too much.
Iacocca was hoping for sales of 5,000 to 10,000 per year, but the 1989 model year ended with just 3,764 sold.
So cool. You never see these things, man.
There's a reason for that.
Well, that's very true.
Many complaints surfaced about the dismal engine, so for 1990, the car, whose name was meant to stand for turbo convertible, was no longer a turbo, and instead had a Mitsubishi-built 3-liter V6, an engine which was shared with many other Chryslers back then, including, ironically, the Daytona, on which the car shared some underlying design. It didn't take long for the automotive press to trash the car in the media, but Iacocca stood by it, blaming its failures on poor marketing. For the 1990 model year, the price increased to $35,000, and consequently, sales dropped to only 1,900 sold. In mid-1990, production finally ended, with the remaining 1,636 being sold as 1991 models, with another price hike to $37,000. The total production run was 7,300, which was no coincidence, since that was the minimum number Chrysler was contractually obligated to build. Adding insult to injury was the fact that when you figure in the overall investment for the TC production, which is estimated to be around $600 million, each car cost Chrysler over $82,000. Today, believe it or not, there is at least one car club devoted to the TC, or at least there was in 2020, when I saw a few at the annual Chrysler Nationals in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, when I was there with my Plymouth Prowler. They even had a sign advertising their TC by Maserati car club. I have to expect that many current owners of the TC are proud of their car. It must have developed a thick skin by now, with so many mocking their choice for a collector car. Someday they may gain in value, but still only as an oddity that will forever be known in history as Lee Iacocca's most costly failure. But thanks to his K-cars and minivans, I don't think his legacy was tarnished by the TC, although the same can't be said for many of the remaining TCs still out there.
Looked like it burned up. I mean, a Chrysler, imagine that.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
By all the loading zones in my dirty little town.